I don't know if you have seen that short Italian video on YouTube of a man who is riding a motorbike one day. He is on his way to a rustic Italian village in the countryside. And he sees an old farmer sleeping, taking a siesta on the roadside. He is lying under a tree next to a donkey that is grazing on the grass. The motorist looks at his wristwatch and he realizes na sira yung relo niya. It is not functioning. And so, he stops by. He approaches the farmer and he asks, "Excuse me, sir, may I know what time it is?" The old farmer sits up. He pushes, excuse me for this, he pushes the donkey's testicles. And then he says, "It's 10 minutes past 10. The motorist scratches his head in amazement, but he proceeds anyway to the village center. He has his watch repaired, and then he proceeds to return home following the same route. On his way back, he sees the same farmer again, and in order to test him, he asks again for the time. And the farmer does the same thing. He pushes up the donkey's testicles, and then he says, "It's 7:15 p.m. Take note, Italy ito. Siguro summer, 7:15, maliwanag pa. The motorist looks at his watch and is amazed na tama yung binigay niyang oras. The farmer was correct, exact time. And so, he awkwardly asks, "Excuse me, but how is it that you are able to tell the exact time by just lifting your donkey's testicles?" And the farmer smiles and he says, "Come here. Look, the donkey's testicles are blocking my view of the village church that is in the horizon. I can only check the time by looking at the clock on the belfry of the village church." He pushes the testicles of the donkey so that the belfry becomes visible, and he says, "There you are, 7:15 p.m. Well, in today's gospel, I think Jesus is reacting in the same way as the old farmer to the people who are wondering how prophets are able to read the signs of the times. You know, the tendency to treat prophets as manghuhula or fortune tellers actually goes back to biblical times, the time of the prophet Samuel. We read about this, for example, in the first book of Samuel, chapter 9, verse 9, where the author says, let me quote, sabi niya, "In former times in Israel, anyone who went to consult God used to say, 'Come, let us go to the seer,' manghuhula. For the one who is now called prophet was formerly called manghuhula, a seer. Back in those times, the seers even used all kinds of gimmicks in order to predict what is about to happen by reading signs. For example, in the flights, the pattern of the flights of birds. Or kuminsan they will slaughter an animal and take out the intestines and interpret the shape of the intestines. Or they would even cut a liver and dissect it and make a prediction on the basis of that. Mga gimmick ng manghuhula. It was not until later that prophets became known as persons who spoke for God by interpreting historical events, mga pangyayari sa buhay. The prophets served as social commentators, perhaps no different from modern-day newspaper columnists who are somehow able to foretell the direction of the country on the basis of the kind of leaders that the people elect or vote for, or their economic policies, or their foreign policies. Madaling sabihin ang future on the basis of the present. In the gospel, if I may paraphrase what Jesus means, parang sinasabi niya ganito, if you can anticipate or preempt or predict what the weather is going to be like by just observing the clouds or feeling the direction of the wind, how can you not interpret the signs of the times? The signs of the times. This became a byword at the Second Vatican Council. The need to be attuned to the so-called signs of the times, meaning to historical developments, and to discern and to interpret them properly para malaman natin ang kalooban ng Diyos, to know God's will. Well, no doubt, prophecy is a gift. But it does not really take some supernatural powers to be able to activate this gift. It takes only a lot of sensitivity and attentiveness. It requires a keen sense of history and a lot of observing, analyzing, and interpreting of the current state of affairs. In short, ang tunay na kailangan ng propeta ay common sense. And that is why we're called to be, all of us Christians, to be a prophetic people. Paanda rin naman ang common sense. Total, tinanggap natin ang Espiritu Santo. You don't need a crystal ball. Or you don't even need gimmicks to foretell the future on the basis of the past and the present. Isa sa mga problema natin na yung mababang sense of history ng Pilipino. At kasalanan yan ng mga nakatatandang hindi na nagkukwento sa mga anak nila at mga apo nila. Today's storyteller is the television or the cellphone. Alam mo kung saan patungo ang isang bansa, which direction humankind is taking through our kind of collective patterns of behavior in the present. Why biological crises occur, katulad ng COVID-19 pandemic, or the radical shifts in the geological and atmospheric patterns, or yung mga deadly volcanic eruptions or super typhoons, or mga new strains of viruses, attacking not just human beings but plants and animals. And why these things cause droughts and famines that will trigger migrations and wars among nations. And why they are a perfectly logical development in the context of global warming, climate change, climate crisis, or climate emergency. What we used to hear only from doomsday soothsayers, yung dating naririnig lang natin sa mga manghuhula, now we hear from Nobel Prize-winning scientists and anthropologists. Kahapon, nag-recollection ang kaparian ng Caloocan. It was facilitated by a Salesian priest and psychologist, Father Dennis Paez. Father Dennis spoke about the tendency of the human mind to engage in what he calls the irrational self-talk, especially when triggered daw by a lot of stresses and fears and anxieties. And what begins as self-talk he says, often leads to a realization of the very things that we are afraid of. Once you begin entertaining it in your mind, the very things you're anxious about, they become a reality. We don't realize that we actually predispose ourselves for tragedy. Si St. Paul, ang tawag niya dito in our second reading, is a state of inner conflictedness. And he verbalizes it by saying, bakit ba ako ganito? Alam ko naman ang tama, pero kabaliktaran nagagawa ko. Alam ko naman ang masama, pero hindi ko nagagawa. Parang kanta yun, di ba? Yung gusto kong bumait, pero di ko magawa. And he says, this is what causes his misery. And he also says that evil is an expert in getting in the way between knowing and willing what is good, and actually realizing it. In simple language, if I may refer back to the story of the old farmer and the motorist, evil is no different from the donkey's testicles that are blocking the view of the belfry. It takes only a little effort to get to unblock the view in order to see what is really there ahead of us. It requires just a little common sense.